I'm honored to bring up the person who will introduce our keynote conversation. Dornsife Dean Amber Miller is a visionary leader, and we're very grateful to her because she's a tireless champion of the Center for the Political Future. She's a physicist who has studied the first nanoseconds of the universe, and she cares deeply about the liberal arts and social sciences that can enable us to cope with our universe as it is and to shape it and make it better. Here on the USC campus, she has spearheaded the idea of the Academy in the public square. She is also a close friend. Ladies and gentlemen, Dean Amber Miller.
Bob, thank you very much. Bob has done a tremendous amount of work to pull this center together and to invite Mike to join and co-direct, and we wouldn't all be here today without his tireless work. So I thank you very much, Bob, wherever he went over there. I also want to really thank the panelists who've come here today, all of you who've come to listen, the staff who've made this possible, and the supporters who've contributed financially to help us make this work. When I was a little kid, I grew up in a rural area way up in a canyon. And if you came to visit me there, you would have met a character who was a gun owner, who was a bit of a survivalist, and who taught his daughter to shoot a .22. You also would have come across somebody who was an environmentalist and who had a PhD, and a hippie. And if I asked almost any one of you in this room to tell me who those two characters, what political party would those two characters live in, I guarantee every single one of you could tell me one of them's a Republican and one of them is a Democrat. The thing is, it wasn't two different people. Both those people were my dad. And what's interesting to me today is that we've heard this morning a whole bunch of interesting things about what drives tribalism, what makes people associate and fixate on a tribe. And none of that is really that disturbing to me in principle, because we all know that we as human beings are drawn to, as Jonas and Allison and others said, what it is that makes us connect with people and be part of a group. That's all okay. What I'm trying to understand is how tribes seem to have affiliated in a one-to-one way now with political party. And that seems new to me, and I want to give you one example. The Civil Rights Act was proposed by Democrats in 1964, and it passed through the House and went on to the Senate, and that's where it met the resistance of 21 Southern Democrats who determined to filibuster the legislation. So the Senate Majority Leader, a Democrat, asked his Republican counterparts to help, and the Republicans came through. And working together, 27 Republicans and 44 Democrats passed the bill. Today, it's really hard to imagine controversial legislation being passed by coalitions of Democrats and Republicans. You could imagine a whole bunch of Democrats with one defector Republican or vice versa, but it's really hard to imagine that kind of thing. So I want to challenge everyone to think this afternoon, and I want to see if anyone can help explain to me, because I don't understand, how did that affiliation become so party-focused? Not just the tribal concept, but why is it party-focused tribal? Because that's the piece that seems new to me, and I don't understand that. And as a physicist, I just want to understand what is going on here. And this is not just a problem in Washington. This pernicious partisan divide is affecting our universities, and it's affecting the way people view our universities. And as a university leader, this one troubles me too. There's a tribe that believes that universities are liberal elitist training grounds for the communist leaders of tomorrow. And there's another one that thinks we are places where oil barons send their offspring to live in dorms named after their grandfathers and work on their backhand. What both groups are saying is, you are not enough of us. And that's probably true. We probably don't include enough of everybody as much as we could, and we could probably do a better job with that. But universities are places that should not be standing for any particular tribe. They should stand for intellectual honesty and integrity and wrestling with the very best evidence available to create new knowledge. And we should be giving students the intellectual tools to evaluate hard, difficult problems for themselves. Do we always get it right? Nope. Nobody does. But our goal here at USC Dornsife is to be the best that we can. And that's what the Center for the Political Future is all about. Led by two illustrious political street fighters, Bob Shrum and Mike Murphy, the center provides a new bipartisan approach to practical politics, one grounded in robust and respectful debate that starts with a common set of facts. For decades, Bob has been the man behind the curtain of the Democratic Party. A speechwriter and one of the most influential strategists, he's worked with some of the biggest names, including Teddy Kennedy, Al Gore, and John Kerry. And it's my pleasure today to introduce the keynote conversation moderated by Mike. Mike, as you all know, is a renowned Republican strategist who's been the top advisor on dozens of Republican campaigns. You've probably seen him on Saturday morning talk shows, on Twitter, and Mike is always insightful, always smart, and almost always hilariously funny. He is not afraid to take on his own party, and he always reminds us that the great rescue device for the Republicans when they get it wrong is, of course, the Democrats. So, Mike, we rely on you to keep us fair and balanced. Our guest today is the former governor and congressman from South Carolina, Mark Sanford. So thank you very much for being here. Governor Sanford shares some of Mike's views. The Washington Post has called him one of President Trump's most eloquent critics. And he's taking his message on the campaign trail, having recently announced his intention to primary President Trump. Governor Sanford received his bachelor's degree from Furman University and his MBA from the University of Virginia, and he is currently a teaching fellow at the University of Chicago Institute of Politics. So please join me in welcoming Governor Mark Sanford and Mike Murphy.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Is this on? Okay, now I hear it. Well, thank you very much, Dean Miller, and thank you so much for the incredible support you've given the Center for the Political Future here. And it was also, I can't tell you, it was incredibly heartening for me to hear a university dean use the term Bolshevik in a pejorative way. So we're moving forward. Even we conservatives have to warm up to that. I'm very happy to be here with my old friend Mark Sanford. Now, I should set up a fascinating career. Mark was originally elected to the U.S. Congress in the old 1st District of South Carolina in 1995. And I was a young consultant, and we all joined up for a candidate at 1% running for president, Lamar Alexander. And we managed to get to about 5%. So we went from that to all kinds of adventures in politics together. He was elected in 2002 governor of South Carolina, served for 2 terms, was called by the Libertarian Cato Institute, easily the best governor in America, then was elected back to the Congress in 2012, where he was a thoughtful critic of the president, and as he has always been a real beacon on kind of the Republican argument to control government spending and entitlements and have an honest discussion about all that from the right. So, very happy to have him here with us today to explore this issue, this question, this dilemma of tribalism. I find, having watched politics since that time in the early 90s, as Mark has, there's kind of been an evolution. And I think one thing we can speak to today is the practical politics of that, kind of how it got here and what incentives might be possible to challenge it a bit. Because the equation we now have in politics is I'm right, you're evil. And the problem with I'm right, you're evil is if you're evil, I can do anything to you and I'm doing right. I can lock you up, I can deny all your arguments, I can criticize your motives reflexively. It's like having I'll do my Midwestern example coming from Michigan, the Ohio State football game, and at the end of the game you murder the other team and burn down the stadium because you've defeated evil. Well, there's no rematch then. It's not good for football. And we're now in a situation where it's very hard to govern because we're all caught in this cyclone. So welcome, Governor. Thank you for doing this. Let's talk a little bit about your journey, because you kind of got to be deep inside Republican politics and congressional politics, both before and after the current president. Maybe talk a little bit about how it's evolved and your experiences, how tribalism actually affects trying to get something done in Washington or in a state house, either one.
I would say, again, I'd echo your thanks to Dean Miller wherever she went. There she is. Thank you for the chance to be here at the other USC. We know a different USC in South Carolina. And I thank you for the way that you and I guess the team at large is pushing to make real a fascinating tombstone, if you will, that I saw as I came onto the university campus in that direction. It's not literally a tombstone, but it's a plaque, and it has the mission, if you will, of the university, which I thought incredible in terms of just this idea of intellectual enlightenment and intellectual pursuit. I went for a sort of a pre-dawn run because I was still on East Coast time, but I thought it fascinating. I thought the degree of correlation between what it said and what you just said, spectacular. So thank you. Mike, treat to be with you. As to how we got here, I mean, I don't know. Other than I would say this, going back to what you said a moment ago, Dean, tribalism in itself is not a bad thing. And we've had it across the ages. And if you look at religious traditions and faith traditions, if you look at sports teams going back to burning down the Colosseum, I mean, we've had it around for a long time, and this notion of affinity with a group of folks with whom you share common sets of ideals and values is something that makes a lot of sense. It's not a bad thing. But we've taken some kind of strange turn, particularly in political world of late, that is disturbing. And I don't know all of its genesis. I think part of it could be driven by congressional district formation and the way in which districts are drawn. Part of it is the balkanization of the media world and the way in which we're devolving down to ever more minute captions in terms of the news you get. You can get the news you want as opposed to the big three stations of not that many years ago. But I think that more than anything, and to this larger point, John Meacham in his most recent book, I think is eloquent on the waves of populist sentiment that have gone through our country over the years, and we've actually survived them fine. I think we're at a different tipping point right now, though, that we all ought to be alarmed about, that brings us to the edge of dynamics that could frankly end our republic. I mean, we're at a scary point. And I think it's particularly pronounced in Washington relative to state capitals, but it's real. And I would say one of the things, and we can get into this, Mike, that's driving it is economic in nature. I was governor at the time, and I had actually been the first governor in the country to refuse or attempt to refuse the president's stimulus package at the time. And so a bunch of school teachers didn't think that was such a good idea. So about 1,000 teachers out on the front steps of the Capitol. And they're holding up pink slips and saying, go home and this and that. And one of the folks who was out watching the protest group came into the office and said, there's another protest group out protesting the protesters. And I'm like, what? Did you guys have a hand in this or what's going on here? But no, just sort of spontaneously, this counter-protest group had showed up. And they were really this sort of pre-start to the Tea Party movement. And I went out and talked to them afterward. And what they said was, we're worried about the American dream. And for us, it's dissolving. And you go from that starting point to the sort of Trump phenomenon that we're in right now. I would argue that tribalism is on steroids now, in large part because of economics. And what they were basically saying at that time, and I think you've seen it filter through with the Trump phenomenon, was we don't necessarily believe that the system is fair. That fundamentally the two precepts that cause people to buy into the American dream are, one, that's an ever-increasing level of opportunity that's produced by the American system. And you look at all the polling right now, and what it says is people at levels that have never before been the case in American history are questioning that. The idea that I did so well, and my kids are going to do better than that, and my grandkids are going to do better than that. People are questioning that. And it's causing a level of angst in the body politic that manifests itself, I think, at times in dangerous ways. And the other thing that I think was interesting about the things that they said was, fundamentally, the other key to the American dream was that it's a fair system. The harder you work, the luckier you got. And so you had this truck driver married to the school teacher, and they made extraordinary sacrifices so that Junior might be able to go to a school as esteemed as this one. And yet what they were saying, and they always recognized that there were the Paris Hiltons of the world. I mean, people who would break every rule out there still sort of filter through. But by and large, the harder you work, the luckier you got. And they were saying, I don't know that that's true, because the stimulus stuff is helping some money center bank, but it's not helping my cousin's pizza shop. And so I think that what we have right now is politics, which is sort of the last step, but an economic equation that is causing greater and greater levels of uncertainty, and it's playing out politically. That's my take, along with the other contributors of tribalism.
Yeah, no, I agree. If you look at the more people think the system doesn't work, they tend to, in kind of a symmetry, go to blow up the system candidates. So populism on the right and populism on the left. If you kind of boil Bernie down and Trump, and you take out some of the, in my view, racist adjacent stuff Trump does, Bernie's saying, hey, we're going to go raid the vault at Goldman Sachs and give you the money to get that PhD in aromatherapy candle making, rather than have to take out a student loan, and Trump's telling my relatives back in Detroit, the Mexicans are stealing all your jobs. I'll go take care of them. So there's a disconnect, and that fuels those kind of people. So when you came back for your second run in Congress after you'd been governor, what was, a lot of us who've worked around politics know there's what you see on cable TV, which is incentivized to have fighting, and every day the trivia is the biggest story and all that. It's a business model. But there are sanctuaries inside the Congress, the members' gym, the members' elevator, and Trey Gowdy, also of South Carolina, says one of the biggest dirty secrets of Congress is when nobody's looking, a lot of us are friends. And what was life like inside the Republican conference with the other members and people you knew as President Trump got into office and things started to turn to this new kind of coarseness? And I know you spoke out about it, and that we'll talk about what happened later. But what was, give us an inside view of kind of what it was like inside the tribe when things started to change.
I mean, certain traditions within the Congress are still alive and well. Others have died off. So there used to be a standing basketball game every day in the House gym at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And you'd watch two guys on C-SPAN just ripping each other up. And then 5 minutes later, they'd be down in the House gym, blue versus white jersey. It's not blue versus red there, but blue versus white jersey, and would be just getting along fine. Sadly, the basketball game has ended, and that's not a question of the Trump phenomenon, but it's indicative of the way that little traditions like that actually held the glue together. And you could go to the commuter element of what's happened with Washington is really from sort of the time of Gingrich on. But I would say more than anything, what I heard from different members was it's not fun anymore, at least on the Republican side. That they would go onto national television and they think they're going to get to talk about their bill or their latest idea, and inevitably what they found was they were responding to Trump's latest tweet. And so what it caused was people just to dig down into the foxhole and just try and play it safe. What they didn't want to be is on the opposite side of a Trump tweet or a Trump comment. And what I heard over and over again from at least Republican members was it's not as fun anymore.
Yeah, I think one of the misconceptions is a lot of the glue that the president has over the GOP polls is love, when I would say it's more fear. Yeah. What do you think? I mean,
and let me just interject on that point. I mean, if you take, I lost my first election in 25 years of politics, June a year ago, and the president gunned for me, which is sort of unusual when you have the president of the United States gunning for you and you're of the same party. I guess that doesn't happen a lot. You're more of a political historian than I am.
It's rare. You
But
have
anyway,
to earn it.
Yeah. But anyway, I lost my train of thought.
No. The idea that love and fear motivating Republicans for this allegiance they have tribally to Donald Trump.
So the night after my election, I was there in the rotunda giving a dome tour, a Capitol tour, a nighttime tour. You have constituents in. Around the corner, there's Jeff Flake. And we sort of step aside from our respective groups, and we begin to sort of catch up a little bit. I hadn't seen him in a while. And he says, we're so sorry about your loss, whatever. And his wife became quite animated. And her point was, we really wanted to have another term in the Senate, but we saw the handwriting on the wall, and if we ran, we'd end up where you did, and we didn't want to do that. And I said, tell me more about the language of what you heard. It was really simple. Are you for or against Trump? Are you for or against Trump? I said, that's fascinating. You're out there in Arizona. That's the exact same thing I heard in South Carolina. And what you'd hear from whether them in that conversation or a lot of others was absolutely fear has been driving the equation. It is not a love equation with the Republicans. I mean, candidly, people will say a lot of things off record and out of camera sight that they are definitely not saying on camera. And so look at somebody like Lindsey Graham. Lindsey and I started in politics together. He was a vociferous opponent and critic of the president. He has done a number of backflips since then and is at a different spot right now, but he's fairly transparent about it. He would say, look, this is the cost of admission. If I speak out, I'm going to end up with a primary challenger. I don't want to end up with that, so I'm going to do what I got to do.
Yeah, I had a Republican senator tell me a few days ago on this new impeachment war that has erupted that in the Republican Senate, if it was a secret vote, 2/3 of the Republican conference would, if this stuff is all true, this was before the whistleblower report was released, would vote to impeach him. But in a public vote, 2, maybe. So it is kind of a hostage dynamic. And I'll bet you felt that in the House, too, when you were in the middle of that battle and getting those tweets. But politics is a cruel, practical business, and people choose to be in the system, and they don't want to leave it. So we're about to have that now. What's your take on this impeachment thing? Do you think it'll be facts versus tribal glue and fear in the U.S. Senate? You have a theory of how it might turn out, assuming that the allegations are proven to at least mostly be true?
Tribal fear will win the day. Facts never win the day. I mean, a lot of good ideas in Congress, but that's not what drives the institution, as you well know.
Yeah, no, that is the painful part. Now, one thing I've, it is, the president has been a driver of many things and has been appropriately often criticized. I've done it all the time. I get fascinating email now. I'm learning about being a tribe of about 5 of us. But yeah, it's been a character building experience. But I don't think it's just the Republicans. I did a little thought experiment, and I'd be curious what you think about this. We brought Mark Lilla out here from Columbia, where he's a professor, a very active liberal, wrote a great book, The Once and Future Liberal, which is kind of a critique of the identity framework of politics from the left. He has tenure, so he's still there. But it provoked a really good discussion. We had a great discussion here on campus with him that went well. But I took a cue from his book, and he had mentioned, so I wanted to see if it was still true. So I went to both party websites this morning. GOP.org and Democrat National Committee, kind of the front door to both official party committees. And I looked for the first list I could find, like 1 click away from the homepage. And the Republicans had one called 11 Principles, which were Constitution, economy, budget, healthcare, veterans, security, education, poverty, values, energy, immigration. The Democrats had a list too. Their list was who we serve. African Americans, Americans with disabilities, Asians, Pacific Islanders, Democrats abroad, ethnic Americans, Latinos, faith community, LGBTQ, Native Americans, rural Americans, long list, senior and retiree. I don't see Irish yet, by the way. Ron, you're onto something. Small business community, union members and union member families, veterans, women, young people, and students. So it is a political lens of groups. And the question is, does seeing politics as, and Lilla argues this, and particularly on the progressive left, as groups competing for power and justice, does that also push politics more into a calculation of tribalism, where voters are implied by the discussion around politics that you owe your voting allegiance to something that's highly connected to your gene code. And that is natural, as we learned in the earlier panel, to some extent about the way we're wired. But does that make it better or worse? My inclination is this obsession with groupism makes things worse and helps divide us all into tribalism. And on the Republican side, you kind of create one big tribe, which is a tribe that doesn't like all that. What's your take, having been in the front lines of this?
Definitely makes it worse. And that's the bigger question of sort of why I'm running, and I think why we need to have a conversation as Republicans on what it indeed means to be a Republican. If it's simply a counterfoil to what may or may not be occurring on the Democratic side on this front, and we're a different group, we're in real trouble. If we're about ideas and ideals, we have some level of hope. I'll give you a quick story. I just got through spending 3 days in New Hampshire, 4 days in Iowa, and now I'm here. And in particular, I've been trying to decide, go, no go in terms of how to spread what scarce resources I have in Iowa versus New Hampshire. And so I was trying to get away from cameras, and I spent one day really going out into the countryside of Iowa and talking to farmers. And I thought, I'm really going to get sort of heartland of America, common sense perspective as I talk to farmers. So I'm talking to this one farmer, and we pulled up at his equipment shed. He's working on a disc harrow, and he's sort of working with his wrench as he's talking to me. And he was originally going to loan me his gator so that I could go out and look at some of his farm. He wanted to show me his farm. But then he's like, wait a minute, you're the guy that's running against Trump. I said, well, I'm not really running against Trump. I'm running for these different ideals that I believe in and that we've frankly always stood for as Republican. No. Are you for or against Trump? I said, well, I'm neither for nor against. I believe in these ideals. We can go through my issues again. And I'm dancing for all I'm worth, and I'm getting nowhere. And so finally, I'm getting desperate, and I'm like, well, look, you didn't accumulate all this equipment and this farm were it not for the fact that you were clearly financially prudent and you built a business, and I think that's spectacular. And surely we can agree on national debt being an issue. The president hasn't done X, Y, and Z on that front. And he turns to me and goes, look, here's the bottom line. Do I worry about the national debt? Yes, it's clearly a big problem. But, the president said he's going to send manned flight to Mars. I believe that they're going to discover moon rocks on Mars that are worth more than gold. We will bring those back to the country, and we're going to be able to pay the national debt off with moon rocks from Mars. I was, at this point, I'm looking at the guy who's traveling with me. His eyes are like that big. I'm thinking, where are we going with this? And yet it goes to the heart of what you're getting at, which is, if we just fall into the tribalism thing of you for or against Trump, end of story, forget the issues, we end up in some very, very weird places.
It's the classic example of creating facts to fit the narrative. Well, if he's going to Mars, he's going to solve the national debt there. It was funny, just one more political story. When I was a young pup at Georgetown, I was running the college Republican, so figuring I'd just taken a course on machine politics. So I learned the first thing you do is steal the best internship for yourself if you're the political boss of the Georgetown College Republican. So I did, and I wound up in the House recording studio back in 1982, and we would have 3 stools, taxpayer paid, of course. And 3 congressmen would show up, and one guy would interview the other 2 about how great they were. And then they'd switch stools. And 90 minutes later, everybody would have a 30-minute show about their amazing accomplishments with their 2 pals. And they would send those tapes back to the home district. 2 of them were from California because cable TV was coming here. So they'd actually, I got my free TV show in my district. It's fantastic. Well, we had a special guest once, which was a man named David Prowse. Anybody know who David Prowse is? He's the guy in the Darth Vader suit in the original Star Wars, British Mr. Olympia. And he was on a PR tour of the U.S. for goodwill. He was part of an initiative in the U.K. about kids, traffic lights, green safety man. And they were kind of trying to come here and, post up against the AAA, whoever was doing safety belts. So anyway, here he was. We interviewed him. He was impressed with the accomplishments. But one multi-term member of Congress, after we were done taping, was very interested in the laser swords and did anybody get wounded on the set. And the British Army had to take a look at those things. They could be useful. And I thought, well, this is a U.S. congressman. This guy thinks the laser swords are real. And not to disparage a former colleague. But anyway, so this is a people business, and people sometimes presume it's going to be the Roman Senate or something. And, I'd be curious. You're out there now in the middle of the tribe, as an apostate, saying, I'm offering myself, and there are 2 other candidates too, Bill Weld and former Congressman Joe Walsh of Illinois, making the same offer. You've been at it a couple weeks. How's the tribe reacting? What kind of, we know about the moon rock guy, but is there another side of that balance sheet, or somebody else thinks the rocks are on Jupiter?
Yeah. There is another side, or I wouldn't be doing it. Now, it's a long shot. It's one of those 100-to-1 kinds of equations, but I've also been, frankly, encouraged by the number of people who are open-minded. So a litmus test for me was going back to the other USC. I went to a USC football game so I'm 2 weeks in, the first weekend after, And I said to a buddy of mine, I said, I need to go just to get a real feel for what really is the mood of the electorate. Statistically, if you look at an SEC football game in the South, of the voters, not everybody voted, but of the folks that voted, probably 80–90% of those folks voted for Trump. And so I went there and I thought, well, maybe I'll get booed. Maybe because I had tried that when in the sort of amp up to deciding to run or not. I went to a Pence rally, and that's a rather interesting experience when you get a bunch of Trumpites holding the signs and making a lot of noise. But so I thought maybe I'll get booed, maybe I'll get Trump, whatnot. I was blown away by the number of people who said, A, it's wrong that the Republican Party in South Carolina is shutting down the primary to try and knock you out of a debate that we ought to have in South Carolina. I was blown away by that. And I was blown away by the number of people who would come up and say, you know, we need to have a contest of ideas. There's something wrong with what we're doing right now. I think that there is a level of Trump fatigue setting in that I saw real and present in the congressional district that I used to represent. In that congressional district, which had been Republican for basically 50 years, it went Democrat. So a Republican beat me in the primary, but ultimately lost in the general election. First time in 50 years it's gone Democrat, and it did so simply because, based on tone alone, soccer moms, working moms, young millennials in droves turned the other way and said, enough of this, I'm out. So I think that there is something going on out there, and I think that you get little pieces of encouragement. They're at times few and far between than you would like, but yes, you do get them.
Let's say for a minute that the 100-to-1 shot happens, and you were to wind up President of the United States. As a practical politician, how would you fight tribalism? Or how should anybody, you know, whoever the next president is from either party, try to change some of these incentives?
Well, I can't remember if it was Einstein or the physics, you would know, but somebody said, I think it was Einstein, it's for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So at the time of the healthcare debate about a year and a half, no, this is 2.5 years ago now, I was doing town hall meetings. They became rather fractious. There was a group called Indivisible. They would turn out big numbers against you, trying to highlight the healthcare issue. So there may be 1,000 people at this town hall meeting. And the first half hour, our junior senator, Tim Scott, was there. He left. But I said I owed to these folks to listen, hear them out. Long story short, the town hall meeting went on for 4.5 hours. First hour, rather unproductive, a lot of yelling, carrying on. Second hour, more muted. By third hour, you're getting into real conversation. By the fourth hour, you're golden. But what was interesting to me about that was at the end, there was one guy who'd just been totally obnoxious the entire time. I mean, which is hard to do for 4.5 hours, but I mean, he had done it strong. And so afterward, I didn't know him, but I knew of him by reputation. And so afterward, I went over, because I mean, a lot of people peeled off at the 2-hour mark, 3-hour mark. He stayed all the way through, just wore me out. And so I went over to him afterward, and I said, look, I don't know you personally, but I know you by reputation. And whatever this was didn't sound like the you that I've heard about at the local level. And he says, here's the deal. If the President of the United States can say anything to anybody at any time on any subject, why can't I? Mm. And so what he's done, the President's given folks license to, at times, behave in rather bizarre fashion. And so I think what you'd begin with is you got to cool this tone, and it's got to begin at the top. Leadership matters in all worlds of work. It's got to begin at the top. I mean, the institutional framework of our government is designed to guard against the passions of men, if you really boil it down. They wanted to put speed brakes and speed bumps along the way. That's the value of our institutional framework. The president's playing to the opposite angle. Let's basically, when he goes out and says Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Fed, is basically an enemy of the state, I mean, you're degrading the institutional bias that makes holds our glue together. So I think you'd begin with tone, and I think you'd begin with basically coolant in terms of where he's coming from in firing people up the way he does.
What institutions do you think are most under threat? Because that's the thing I worry about most. This era will pass, maybe short, maybe long, but the idea is you say that any language is now acceptable, even from the top. You wonder what incentives you can put into the system.
I didn't say that, but I said that gentleman that was
right.
chewing me up did, yeah.
So, but if that becomes more accepted behavior, that was the trigger for that one person, and you see it more in the pop culture. And of course, you know, the media puts a spotlight on whatever's happening now, and that speech is what's happening now, so it gets a free amplifier, which then it becomes a feedback loop to get bigger and bigger. What can a president do, change their own tone? But I wonder what else, because I have a theory, having worked for so many politicians, that a lot of them who are caught in this would like to be set free from it. I mean, I think there's kind of a secret constituency of people in politics who are tired of all this. And you wonder what the reset button could be. Just kind of blue skying ideas here.
I think the reset button is that it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And ultimately, I mean, I think we're playing with the end of our civilization if we don't watch out. I mean, for those of you who have insomnia, there's a great book written by a professor from Harvard and a professor from the University of Maryland entitled This Time It's Different, Reinert and Rogoff. And they chronicle the last 800 years of financial history as it relates to governments. And basically what they found was that in every instance, civilizations got to a tipping point wherein they had to decide, do we go back to what made us competitive and perhaps a world power in the first place, or do we stay on this happy but ultimately unsustainable cycle of upward government spending, whatnot? And 9 times out of 10, they said this time it's different. Of course, it never was. And so Reinert and Rogoff chronicle those 800 years of civilizations and the way in which they imploded. If you look at where we are economically, so we're 121 months into this economic recovery, which is about double the length of every other recovery that we've seen since basically World War II. And when we tip down, and we will at some point, the rule of thumb has been it's about a 5 and a 5 deal. So the Fed has basically lowered interest rates by about 5 percentage points in combating every single recession that's come since World War II to present. And concurrently, deficits have gone up by about 5 points from a fiscal standpoint, as the federal government has spent money trying to deal with the recession. We don't have that elbow room. And so we could get into a real messy pickle as it relates to the economy that I think unleashes animal spirits that we haven't even seen. I mean, we're at the tip of a very dangerous iceberg unless we begin to reel this in. So what would reset it? I think it getting worse, which is not exactly what anyone wants to hear, but I think that's the cusp of what we're at.
Yeah, if it fails, then there must be another way with pain. That is a handsome idea, but I think indeed you might be.
No. Just to bore everybody, there was a Scottish historian lived in the 1800s, Sir Alex Francis Tytler, and the quote, there's some question with the quote, was it really attributed to him or not? But the larger sentiment, I think, is the accurate one. His quote was, after studying history, allegedly for the whole of his life, his quote was, "A democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote for themselves largesse from the public treasury, with the result that a democracy always fails under loose fiscal policy and is generally followed by a dictatorship. The average age of the world's great civilizations has been 200 years. These nations have progressed through this sequence: from bondage to spiritual faith to great courage to liberty, liberty to abundance, abundance to selfishness, selfishness to complacency, complacency to apathy, apathy to dependency, and from dependency back again into bondage." We're playing with real fire. So I don't want to get talk on the down cycle.
No.
This thing's more real than we think.
It's a powerful argument. It's a practical politician, and again, through the prism of tribalism that we're here to talk about. What's your observation on the Democratic primary race going on right now? It looks to have a tribal magnetism all its own from the progressive left to me. I noticed that the two moderate, quote-unquote, candidates, but who are economically more in the center-left scale, in terms of their polling numbers of favorable rating to unfavorable rating among Iowa caucus goers, the most important voters right now, are 2-to-1 upside down. Bullock, the governor of Montana, and Bennett, the senator from Colorado, who have argued that we're the center-left folks. The Iowa caucus voters have responded by raising their unfavorable ratings to the moon. I doubt either will be in the race in 60 days. On the other hand, it seems most of the calculations are to be worried about being criticized from the left. But what's your take as somebody who's had a name on a ballot, had an unbeaten streak of winning campaigns until the late business with the Trump candidate? How do you see the Democratic race rolling out?
I don't have a really good feel for base politics on the Democratic side, so I don't know. But when I talk to Democratic friends, what they say is, indeed, you're right, that the momentum is on the Warren side, the Bernie side, that they see Biden, though he may have great electability, subsiding with regard to what comes next. Beyond that, I'm just sort of watching with everybody else.
Gotcha. Well, let's go to questions and answers. Now, the USC Legal Time reminds me this is not a campaign event. We're talking about political tribalism, but any question welcome. And in fact, I'll bet there were fewer than 8 Republican primary voters here, so we're totally covered on the campaign event front. We can prove with science that's definitely not what it is. But we'd love to have your questions on any topic about tribalism or what it's like to run for president as a guerrilla insurgent in the Republican Party of this era. I see somebody right there. We'll go there first and then over here.
Governor, and Congressman, coming from South Carolina, you would have a unique insight into the issue of race and tribalism. And I'm just wondering if you wanted to give us a perspective on whether race is also pulling us apart.
I don't know. It certainly has pulled us apart, and it's a mixed bag. So if you go to the Midwest, or you go to a variety of different places where there have been tragic racial outcomes, and there's outrage, appropriately so. But I would contrast that to Charleston. I don't know if you're familiar with horribly, a nut job walks into a church in Charleston, kills a number of parishioners, and then in its aftermath, the families say, as they line up in the courtroom setting, we forgive you, we forgive you, we forgive you. And what that did was it created an amazing gulf vacuum within the South Carolina political operating environment, such that everybody was just so dumbstruck that they were puzzled, and they said, well, you know, what do we do in light of that kind of grace? And they brought the Confederate flag off the State House grounds in South Carolina. So Nikki Haley certainly implemented it. But the thing, because 2 weeks before, Nikki was arguing, well, it's on its place of memorial. We have a compromise with the monument to folks that came over in the slave trades. At the same time, we have a monument in the form of the flag that flies on the state, not on the Capitol. It was taken down years ago, but on the state. We have the compromise. She would argue that 2 weeks before. And yet, in the wake of that amazing level of grace, it created a political vacuum that brought the Confederate flag off of the State House grounds and into a monument, into a museum there in Columbia, South Carolina. So I would say it's a mixed bag. It's based and predicated on reaction. I'd say it's still a force, particularly in Southern politics. There's a very strong, I wouldn't call it tribal as much as I'd call it a church-denominated or driven phenomenon within the black community. And it's formidable and it's real. It drives more of the Democratic politics of our state than the Republican Party politics.
Next question. Yes, ma'am. We have a microphone coming right over there, one of our spry helpers.
Thank you. I wondered what your opinion is about Iowa and New Hampshire setting the presidential race for the rest of the country, those tribes in those states.
I'm going to quickly defer to Mike, who has I've got 2 weeks of experience on this subject. He's got many, many years and a whole lot of races in both places. What I would be, I guess what I would say is, I've been really impressed with New Hampshire, given its scale and the way as a candidate you can actually move around the state. I'm impressed with its level of independence. I'm impressed with, you know, anybody who has a slogan that says "live free or die" is pretty out there in terms of the independence in the financial front. The financial conservatism, the fact that they have no income tax, I think is telling. And so I think it's pretty fertile ground for where I'm going to go spend a bunch of time. Iowa seems to be much more complex. I still can't get my arms around the caucus process, but it requires a level of infrastructure that will be very difficult for me given the number of different communities you have to touch. Still an amazing array, though. I mean, you'd end up with decided Trump folks, but at the same time, you'd end up with very progressive folks in downtown Des Moines or other. There's a little town called Grinnell, and I talked to some amazingly progressive people there just a couple of days ago. So I think that they're pretty oddly, they're not a coastal spot obviously in Iowa, and they miss that. But outside of that, I mean, I think that they get a pretty good cross-section of the American voter, and if they could just have South Carolina in the equation, would be all right, but that's not happening.
Yeah, I'd just quickly say the argument against is why do these little states have all that power? The argument for is if you're a candidate who is not heavily resourced, you need a little state because that's the thing you can crack with shoe leather and a little bit of money and a message that resonates to leverage yourself into the big show. People say, well, the Californians all get mad because we're a bank. The candidates come here, take the money, and leave. But campaigning here is a $50, $100 million effort. We're a country. We're enormous. If you want to win the coming early March California primary, the best way to do it is win New Hampshire, because the momentum effect will carry you forward here. So it's the system we have, and we could debate in another thing whether it's good or not, but it does give a bit of a shot to smaller, less-known candidates, which I think is generally a good thing. All right. Yes, sir, right over there.
One of the dimensions of tribalism that we have not mentioned thus far today is religion, and in particular, the domination of the Republican Party by the evangelical Christians, and which has been going back as far as Gingrich, back in the 90s. To what degree do you think this is a divisive element in the process, and what kind of remedies might exist for making the Republican Party a little less the prisoner of the evangelical Christian movement, which has some very serious limitations in terms of being able to be effective across the political spectrum?
I did a show with Conan this morning. And,
Conan Nolan, here
I
on
had a very
KNBC.
interesting conversation. We got into this, actually. I don't understand it. I mean, it seems to me a Faustian deal, wherein a lot of folks within the evangelical community have said, look, his actions are not consistent with our faith and its precepts, but we'll get some good Supreme Court appointments out of it. He'll protect on the issue of abortion. We'll get a tax cut. So I think it's horribly pragmatic, which is well outside of the confines of what faith ought to be about. But I think that's the equation these days.
Yeah, no, to the extent there's a dominant demographic interest group in the Republican primary electorate, that is it. And the problem the Republican Party has now, I have no problem with those voters at all being in the party and being active. I agree with them on a lot of issues, but it's too small to win an election, particularly in a changing country. You've got to reflect the demography. And if we're the candidate of old Sunbelt white folks in a country where America under 18, which is the future America, is only 54% Caucasian, we're giving up the future. I mean, I often joke that when our voters are so old, Mitt Romney is the president of Americans over 65, so when the Republican Party is on the march, you can see us coming one step at a time. If the Democrats ever outlaw use tennis balls, it'll be over. So that reflects the fact that we're shrinking our appeal at a time when demographics are changing. And I think the great post-Trump issue, other than rebuilding the institutions of a civil democracy and reminding us that issues that bring us together in an American identity, I think is a superior politics to competing groups, all juggling for power and trying to address historical grievances. I think that's naturally divisive. I believe the big problem for the Irish and the Republicans and frankly conservatives, which drive the energy, is what is a modern conservatism? Because politically we're about to surrender everything to the left, and they're on the march now and we're not. We saw their hands. Yes, ma'am, in red there. Trojan red.
Oh, thank you. It's really always great to see you speak, Mr. Murphy. And it's such an honor to have you here today, Congressman and Governor. So my question goes into something that you spoke about in your opening with the economic situation our country is currently facing and the impending recession that many people believe is coming. I went to a talk recently that talks about the volatility of economics and how that leads to an increase in the irrational aspects of tribalism, essentially, and the illogical thought processes that are sometimes associated with that. I was wondering if you have any ideas on economic policy that could be in place to basically predict these problems that could arise in a recession and magnify these. While I perhaps agree that things do need to get worse before they can get better, I'm curious, as a person involved in policy and a policymaker, what you foresee as us being able to do.
Well, I'd back up and say, I mean, the grandest of all sort of crazy tribalism moves in recent history is Germany. And I want to be clear, I'm not liking Trump to Hitler. But I'm saying if you read Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, there's some very, very scary parallels in terms of the way politics are driven by economics. And as we all know, the story of Hayek's book in The Road to Serfdom is basically he argues that democratic systems over time become more and more dysfunctional as they become bigger and more cumbersome, to the point that the electorate gets more and more incensed about the way in which government isn't working for them, to the point that a strong man comes along and says, I'll take care of these problems for you. You may have to give up a few freedoms. And it's the story of, again, Hitler's rise to power. I'm not saying Trump is Hitler. I want to be very clear on that. But I'm saying the movement, that accession, is a precursor to things that we could see in this country, particularly if the economy turns south. Part of why I'm a conservative is if you look at the pages of history, it's littered with a lot of civilizations that have gone by the wayside based on the fact that that dynamic always seems to play itself out. So my remedy would be what I've always believed, which is, in fact, what government you have ought to be functioning and efficient, but you got to make it limited because they're just built-in inefficiencies that go with government that are the glue that hold it together. And in essence, the grease that makes it work is inefficiency. It is, I mean, you want to have an efficient system, have a king or a despot. It may be real efficient, but it's not very democratic. And so I just think the idea of limited government, I'm a big fan of, based on the automatic inefficiencies that have to be built into a democratic system. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Mike.
No, I concur with that. And I also concur, Trump is not Hitler because he couldn't do the comb over. It would break the comb. No, that's just me taking a cheap joke. I think he might be Juan Perón, though. There are real similarities there. But I'm a Hayek fan as well. And when there's insecurity and the system isn't working, people go to they trade security for freedom. And the problem is when you start giving up security, the security tends to want to stay. And then when freedom is under attack, speech becomes under attack. And it can compound in a bad way. So we are stressing our political culture now, but I'm an optimist about America, and I think this will pass. Yes, Professor.
Thank you for being here. I was wondering if you'd comment if you think that tribal political polarization or other factors are really driving the impeachment investigations.
No, I mean, to Nancy Pelosi's credit, I mean, she's resisted about as long as she could on this. So Al Green, I was still in Congress when Al Green was talking about it. He had a couple of different efforts to try and push the impeachment thing. It was going nowhere. It's been picking up steam, and finally the dam breaks, and you got to deal with it. I think she's been anything but tribal, frankly, in her approach. She's just dealt with the political realities that she has to deal with as a bunch of members come to her based on upward pressure through the Democratic side of the equation. So I would say no. I mean, and if you look at the math, I mean, I'd really encourage folks to read David Brooks' column. It's just spectacular. He talks about sort of the demerits and dangers of going down the impeachment route, in particular for Democrats. So yeah, I maybe at the grassroots level, there's some tribal component that's driving the equation that creates the pressure on the members, that creates the pressure on leadership. But I'd say at the top, I think they've been fairly resistant to that driving the train.
I'd say the main tribal thing right now is on the Republican side to deny extremely troubling facts about the president's behavior. They're now becoming apparent. I think we have time for one more, maybe two, if you're quick, sir, in the back, right there.
Hi, Governor. Thanks for coming. I appreciate you contributing to this conversation. I had a question about your campaign, but it's also related to tribalism, which is the topic for today. According to the latest Quinnipiac poll, among Republican primary voters, Trump is currently at 80%. You're at 2%. So how do you plan on changing those numbers over the course of the next 4 months before primary voters start voting? And if the odds today are correct and Trump is renominated, do you plan on circumventing the current issue of political tribalism? And do you see a Democrat among the current crop that you could hold your nose and vote for? Or would you respect the wishes of your fellow primary voters and support the president?
So I don't know where we are on thin ground here. I don't want to go into a political conversation just based on.
You can address it. Yeah.
Okay, I can.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
all right.
no,
Okay. Gotcha.
We're all right. We're just being careful because
you're a 501c3.
we're regulated by the government.
Right.
Who says speech isn't regulated?
Yeah.
Well, if we buy an air ticket, there's no honorarium involved. The governor volunteered to do this, fly across the country for us, but we did pick up a air ticket, so we're just being a little careful about that.
So as to how you get there, I mean, it goes back to what Mike was just talking about with regard to the value of a small state like New Hampshire. Without laying out our campaign plan going forward, I'm going to be spending a lot of time in a state like that. I'll put it that way. And either there is an audience for that message or there's not. Either there is some level of Trump fatigue or there's not. Either those soccer moms and working moms and millennials that I've talked to at length in the coast of South Carolina have a similar, group that would mirror their sort of reaction to some of what's going on in Trump world or not. So again, I'm 2 weeks into this. I'm going to give it my all, and we'll see where it goes. I think it's an important conversation to be had at a minimum. Go ahead, sir.
No, just when I hear the 80-2 polling number, I'm remembered of one of the great Marine generals, Chesty Puller in Korea, who when surrounded 20-1 by a hostile Chinese Communist army, they said, well, now we're surrounded. He said, good, they can't get away. So Trump will be, you got a big target
And I would
there.
say this, just in terms of glimmers of hope, while the latest polling indeed does show the president 80, 90%, depending on which poll, the last poll in New Hampshire had half of the respondents saying that they thought that the president ought to be primary, that there ought to be a conversation amongst Republicans as to what it meant to be a Republican, which says that there is some chink in the armor. The other chink in the armor, as I see it, is if the president really was enjoying and knew that he could sustain 80 or 90% kinds of numbers, the last thing in the world they would have done would be to cancel the primary in South Carolina. In the world of politics, if you have a chance to lock in an 80 to 90% win, you do it. And yet what they did was they canceled the primary process in South Carolina, wherein I actually do have a degree of background. I do have a degree of political infrastructure because I was a two-term governor. I've built a couple of successful organizations statewide that have been able to, in essence, make a case in that state. The fact that they canceled that, again, first in the South primary, says somebody's looking at numbers that say support may not be as widespread or as lasting as others polls have been suggesting.
We'll take our last question from the esteemed gentleman right back there.
Hi, thank you very much for your spirited and wonderful discussion. I've got a question about tribalism. If some rhetoricians say that if you allow me to set the terms of the debate, I will win. And I think that for the last 40 years, a small number of wealthy families have directed the terms of the debate. The American Enterprise Institute, Cato, Koch brothers Family Foundation, the Heritage Foundation, by making donations that are tax-free to organizations that are essentially political outreach. So, for example, the rhetoric of deregulation actually meant decriminalization, as seen by the activities of, led directly to the activities of Enron and costing the state of California billions of dollars. And I wonder if you think that this rhetoric that has been consciously and deliberately created has led in part to the tribalism that we're all suffering from.
I mean, yeah, on the margin, but I mean, I don't buy into the conspiracy theory that says a couple of wealthy families or a couple of wealthy interests have driven the political system of our country. I still believe in our democratic ideals and the institutions that support it too much to buy into that. And I'd say there's a fair amount of evidence to that end. So while the Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, other groups like that can produce great working papers, to say that they drive the daily agenda in Congress, I think is at odds with reality. I think in reverse, if you look at a lot of the real grassroots organizations of our country, they have, frankly, more political effect than these bigger groups do. I mean, I'd give two examples. Whether you like or dislike the NRA, it's amazing how effective they are. And the reason, in part, they're effective is you go down to the local level with the NRA banquet or the Ducks Unlimited banquet. They're down there at a grassroots level, and they make their voice heard. Similarly, I remember when I first ran for Congress, a woman showed up, Leah Chase was her name, great lady. And she showed out and did the small things that a volunteer would do. I mean, a couple of $20 checks, and would come in maybe one day every week, to give a couple of hours of volunteer time. And anyway, I won, and it wasn't until a couple years later that I discovered that the local Jewish Community Center had organized it. There were 7 of us in that race, with one person going to each of the different candidates, so that no matter who won, somebody would be able to say, I was there with you at the very beginning. And so to this day, I will call Leah back because she was there with me at the very beginning. But if you look at AIPAC or groups like that, they're fundamentally strong because at a grassroots level, they're deeply engaged, just as Leah was in my first campaign. And so I hear you, but I'm not as suspicious as some of those activities based on my own experiences, wherein grassroots has proven even stronger.
Yeah, I'll tell a quick story to wrap up on that same thing. I used to be a consultant at H&R Block, the big corporation that sells tax return services all over America, and they got 100 lobbyists on the payroll because they're very interested in the tax code because their business, deals with it every day. So we're having the big annual confab with 5,000 H&R Block franchisees who have the stores there, and they're 20 of the most expensive lobbyists in the world sitting over there, and it was a good meeting. And during the question and answer session a few years ago, guy in the back raises his hand. This is when all the talk was tax reform. They're going to change the tax code. Now, H&R Block didn't really care about that. They deal with whatever it was, so if you said tomorrow no more tax returns needed, they'd probably be concerned. But anyway, guy in the back, kind of a little embarrassed, kind of blue-collar guy in his 50s. Hey, how you doing? I'm from the Midwest. I got a trucking company. I got 11 trucks. A little trickles of applause for that. And my wife likes doing the books, but, there's not a lot to do, so we got a block franchise because she likes doing taxes. Now we got 2 of them, but I keep getting calls from our local congressman. We used to put up yard signs for him asking me about the tax code. And all the lobbyists are sniggering a little bit, like, who was the congressman? Paul Ryan. The guy who's going to write the tax code is calling the block guy in his home district because that's who he trusts, because he knows he's a straight shooting guy and a local member of the community, and put up a few yard signs and was there at the beginning, as opposed to $2 million worth of lobbyists. So people kind of assume sometimes. What you always got to remember about politics is it's open and it responds to people. And the greatest weakness is a lot of people choose not to participate because they don't think it's open. Big mistake. It is the most open source system ever. So I'll finish by restating the mantra for both parties of the center that Bob and I advocate every day. Learn how it works and participate. Thank you so much for coming, Governor. We really appreciate you for doing that.